By the 1440s, England was on the brink of defeat in the Hundred Years' War. Disunity amongst the English nobles was beginning to set in. Finances were heavily stretched, and all that could be done to stave off defeat was occasional peace treaties and the actions of battle hardened warriors like John Talbot. All the same, final defeat was now only a matter of time. It was during one of the truces that the King of England, Henry VI, was betrothed to Margaret of Anjou, who was a niece of the French King Charles VII. Charles's wife, Marie, was the sister of Margaret's father, Duke René of Anjou. The marriage between Margaret, only 15, to the 23-year-old Henry took place in April 1445, and Margaret was crowned a few weeks later. Margaret, in her life as Queen Consort of England, would make quite the impression. Margaret's arrival in England coincided with increasing tensions in the country. These tensions centred around enmity between Richard, Duke of York, and Edmund Beaufort. Edmund was quite clearly jealous of the Duke of York, and he began to use the new and impressionable young Queen to advance his agenda against Richard. The Duke of York was recalled to England from France, and he was ordered to go to Ireland, where he would oversee matters there. Beaufort was now made Lieutenant of France. Margaret, who had taken a liking to Beaufort, had actively encouraged this arrangement, thereby fostering huge resentment between York and Beaufort. The appointment of Beaufort as lieutenant did nothing for English prospects in France, and by 1450, after the defeat at the Battle of Formigny, Normandy fell back into French hands. 3 years later, Gascony would also fall after the defeat at Castellon, leaving England to hold only Calais. Anger at loss after loss was substantial, and those closest to the king, like Beaufort, William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, and the Queen herself, were widely blamed. After numerous failed military expeditions, the English crown and the country's economy, already in serious trouble as it was, began to really suffer, and rebellions were inevitable. In January 1450, a man named Thomas Shane, who called himself Bluebeard, was arrested in Kent for inciting rebellion against the king, with de la Pole being one of his primary targets. Shane, or Bluebeard, was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. But it would not be the last of the king's troubles. A couple of weeks after Shane's execution, the king's palace at Eltham was severely damaged by a lightning strike which caused a fire to burn down a number of rooms, including the kitchen and hall. In the midst of all the country's troubles, this was hardly the most pressing of matters, but some at the time may well have taken it as an ominous sign of more problems to come. If so, they would be proved right. After the fall of Normandy, Henry VI and William de la Pole had to face the wrath of a furious Houses of Parliament. De la Pole was arrested and thrown into the Tower of London. Even though the king was a man of simplicity, even Henry had enough sense to realise that de la Pole's life was in jeopardy, and he banished him from England for 5 years, for his own protection more than anything. As well meaning as Henry had been in sending de la Pole out of the country, it did the Duke of Suffolk little good. He made preparations to sail to Brittany with a few vessels, and in late April 1450 he set off from Dover. However, he didn't get very far. His little fleet was confronted by a huge ship named Nicholas of the Tower. Its occupants arrested de la Pole, gave him a mock trial before beheading him. The hated de la Pole, who chroniclers refer to as the evil Duke, was now dead, and his corpse lay on the beach for a number of weeks before it was eventually collected and buried. Still, the king's troubles kept on coming. Another protest broke out in Kent, a notoriously troublesome area throughout the medieval period. This was led by a man named Jack Cade, originally from Ireland. Cade intended the protest to be as peaceful as possible, or so he said. The king sent some notables, including the Archbishops of York and Canterbury, to treat with Cade and see what his demands were. Essentially, Cade wanted an overhaul of government, which the king's advisers and Henry himself viewed as impertinent and dismissed them out of hand. At least, though, Cade and his followers remained peaceful, for the time being at least. The problem was, although Cade may have said that he wished to avoid violence, it would be hard to control the large band of men that were following him, especially when they felt justifiable grievances against the crown and its government, and Cade knew this all too well. The disregard Cade's request was shown would have done nothing to cool the heated atmosphere, and Cade himself became angered. Realizing things were about to turn ugly if he didn't act, the king declared that he would arrest all traitors in government and throw them in the Tower of London. However, it was too little too late. Cade and his men now dropped all pretences, and things were about to turn violent. The treasurer was arrested and beheaded, and then Cade apprehended the sheriff of Kent and beheaded him at Mile End, along with the head of a third man. The heads were put on spikes and paraded and mocked. Cade and his men then became embroiled in a fierce fight near London Bridge with royal soldiers, where scores were killed on both sides. Desperate to try and restore some sense of order, Henry announced a general pardon, and the men of Kent, including Cade, did begin to go home. However, a band of royal officials pursued them, and a few days later, Jack Cade was killed in the fighting. Although Cade had made promises to keep his followers in good order, it was fairly obvious that this wasn't going to happen, and Jack Cade would have known that. His rebellion was not quite as destructive or impactful as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which also found its origins in Kent. It was another damning indictment on the state of England during the reign of Henry VI, and further undermined what little authority the king had. It didn't help the king's cause that Cade had been open to negotiating with the king, but Henry and his advisers clearly felt that was beneath them. A king with more shrewdness would have made empty promises to keep Cade and his band happy. Ensure they left London relatively unharmed, and then arrested the rebels after they had gone home. Henry had shown that he was not capable of ruling. As we have seen, throughout 1450, England was in a state of high tension. In September, that was exacerbated by the return of the Duke of York from Ireland, and some hated members of government, including John Sutton, Lord Dudley, who had been threatened by Jack Cade's rebellion, turned to the Duke for protection. Richard then marched on London. In November, the king called Parliament with most of the nobles, bringing an armed retinue with them, fearful that the enmity between the Duke of York and Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, coupled with the general anger across the country, could spark a civil war. Violence across London was rife, and threats were made against Somerset, but York instead tried to calm the situation, beheading some of the more serious troublemakers. On the 3rd of December, the king and his barons marched through London in a show of unity and a desperate attempt to quell the anger. Across the Channel, the French king Charles VII ramped up his efforts to seize control of Gascony, England's last significant holding in France. If there was anger and resentment after Normandy's fall, the eventual and now inevitable loss of Gascony would send England over the edge. The state of the country could be summed up by a parliamentary roll of 1450. The roll stated that many murders, manslaughters, rapes, robberies, riots, affrays, and other inconveniences greater than before were committed that year. Although the losses in France certainly didn't help, the mood in the country had been worsened over the previous decade by a series of brutal winters and terrible famines. It's hardly a surprise people were angry, and in late 1450 and into 1451 there was another public show of anger, this time across Sussex. Led by two brothers named John and William Murfold, the common people in Sussex began attacking nobles and clergymen and demanded that Henry VI be deposed. In a public speech, the Merthold brothers called the king a fool and said that another man must be anointed in his place. Although the rebellion did spread, it was not too serious, unlike Kate's rebellion, and never threatened to spread. But it was another indicator of serious discontent across England. By 1452, it was clear Henry VI was sitting uneasily on the throne of England, as Richard Duke of York became an ever more prominent figure in English politics. To many, he looked like a natural replacement as king. Richard was a descendant of Edward III and had conducted himself well in France and Ireland, and he was certainly ambitious as well. But what were those ambitions? For the time being, he maintained he was loyal to the king and simply wished to remove all traitors, namely Somerset, from power. Henry, though, clearly didn't believe him. When he heard York was marching on London again, the king fled to Northampton. Eventually, York and Henry met at Blackheath, where they were reconciled, and the Duke paid homage to the king. And in March 1452, at St. Paul's Cathedral, the Duke vowed that he had never rebelled against Henry, nor would he in the future. Fleetingly, that year, through the actions of John Talbot, England had been given some hope in Gascony. Talbot, in a devastating raid across Gascony, took town after town, castle after castle, briefly recapturing Bordeaux. But in 1453 he was defeated and killed at the Battle of Castellon. Talbot, make no mistake, was feared and respected by the French, and his small victories may have briefly improved the mood across England. But with his death, Gascony was lost forever. The Hundred Years' War was over. England, with no foreign enemy to fight, now turned on itself.